She didn't believe me. I got no reason to make it up. But we had 23 cards turned in last time. Remember, I had you check off on what you wanted to study. And 7 of them were for Ruth, Esther, and Job. And then 3 of them, people had wrote in Revelation at the bottom. And then there's a whole bunch of ties for 2, on 2. John, Gospel of John, 1 Corinthians, something else, I forget. And then we had 1 for intertestamental period. And that's about it. Yeah, Revelation had 3 of them for that, written in the bottom, yeah. But 7 of them, and I meant to figure out the percentage, but I didn't. But I guess I could figure it out here. I got my calculator, but that's all right. So we'll study that, but that'll be good. The kids, at least one of the teenage classes will be studying that. That is the Ruth, Esther, and Job. That's the theme for the last leaders. Not that that really affects the adult class so much, but it'll be good for us to study those books together in a way as we go through this. But anyway, the book of Ruth is a short little book. Well, this has a range. Does this? Oh, let me go check something else out. All right, Ruth, the book of Ruth. And I have kind of subtitled that an account, it should be an of in there, an account of fidelity, faith, and family. Fidelity, faith, and family. And we'll see that as we go through this little book. And it's often the subject of ladies' classes and things of that nature. But it is an excellent book that we can learn a lot of things from. And let me get my Bible over here. All right, but before we get into the text, let's just do a little introduction on the book of Ruth. The account of Ruth is during the period of the Judges. If you see chapter 1, verse 1. And actually, even before we get into that, we'll look for these things as we go through that. But there's a fidelity in loyalty to God, loyalty to family. There is faith in this book, and then there's, of course, family. And if you look at the first verse, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. And so it begins with, in this time frame, is in the period of the judges. And then if you look in the last verses in Ruth chapter 4, verse 18, actually if you go back up to verse 16, and Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom. Anyway, she has a child up here. And Boaz and Ruth, she became his wife in verse 13. But anyway, it ends with the lineage of David. The lineage of David. And so, and as we're going to find out, Ruth is a Moabitess. And so we have, and she is one of the women mentioned in the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, along with Rahab and Tamar and Bathsheba is not mentioned by name, but she is mentioned as the wife of Uriah, and then of course Mary. But she is significant in the lineage of Jesus, and so it's a very good little profitable book for us to study. All right, so it begins in the period of Judges. What do we know about the period of Judges? Well, there's a key verse in there. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that phrase, there was no king in Israel, occurs in Judges about 5 or 6, 7 times. And that exact verse is at least twice in there, and sometimes worded a little bit different there. But it was chaos. Judges was a period of chaos. Remember, God's people would get in trouble. God would bring oppression upon them. They would repent, and God would deliver them. And then they go for a little while, and the same old thing happens again. And when we think about that, we think about maybe some of the things our country's going through about trying to eliminate all standards of authority, that anything goes. Boys are not boys anymore. If they think they're girls, they can go over here or whatever. We're just becoming a nation where we're just seeming like we're trying to act like there's no difference between nothing. And that's the way it was in the book of Judges. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And we have that going on today. But yet in that context, just like in any context of this world, there still can be some people that do right. And that's what we have with Ruth. She's still a person that's doing right, even though she lives in a culture where everyone's doing what's right in his own eyes. And so that's a tremendous lesson just right off the bat there. All right, notice also perhaps Samuel as produced. Oh yeah, man, look at that. Left out the term authorship. But anyway, that has to do with authorship there. You know, we don't. It doesn't say in here who wrote it. There is Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition would attribute that to Samuel, but it's based on some things. It doesn't necessarily require Samuel, and so you know, dogmatic's kind of a big word, but you know, there's not enough evidence to be certain about it one way or the other. But we do know whoever wrote it was inspired of God. We do know that it's a tremendous small piece of literature. In fact, if you look at like the commentaries and such, one of the things they'll say about it is that it's you know, one of the best short stories written. You know, and we think of a short story, but it's a tremendous lesson, tremendous book right there. But the authorship, Samuel is the name that always comes up. But again, it's not certain for sure, stake your life on it type of thing. Now the date of composition, we know the period of the Judges was roughly 1300. Well, there's a strong period there, but sometime between the end of the Judges and the beginning of the monarchy, you know, with King Saul and David, and that 950 is about when David began to reign and so forth. But somewhere in between that book was written. Now again, when it actually took place and when it was written may not always be the same time, maybe years later, whatever. But again, there's nothing. Well, you know, the language itself shows customs of that time, type of words that are used, point to that period. But again, to precisely pinpoint it exactly when it was written, we don't have a whole lot of the you know, like historical type stuff in there to pinpoint it. Now, some books of the Bible we do have historical stuff, you know, that we can pinpoint the accuracy of when it was written more than others. But Ruth is not one of those books. All right, characteristics of the book of Ruth. And actually, right before you even start this, what do you know about the book of Ruth? Just right off the bat. Anything stand out? She stuck with her mother-in-law. That's a good, big part of that, right? Part of that fidelity faith. What did you say, Colleen? Yeah, they all lost their husbands. All the three women that are mentioned. Mm-hmm. She was a Moabite. Mm-hmm. Yep. Both. The sons died. The father died, and the two sons died, and the daughter. So the Naomi was left with her two daughter-in-laws. But notice the significance. She was a Moabite. Who were the Moabites? Well, you don't have to know their lineage or anything, but they were not Israel.
Descendants of Lot.
Yeah, descendants of Lot. Through that thing we talked about Sunday morning in Genesis 19. They were descendants of Lot. But they were not under the covenant of Israel. They were not, you know, God's people. Now, they may have proselyted before these boys married them. We don't know. We'll talk about that in a minute. What else stands out about Ruth? Okay. Well, here's some of the characteristics. This you may not have known. Didn't realize this till studying for this lesson. But over 60% of the book of Ruth is dialogue, and that means it's conversations between people and not just narrative. You know, it's conversations between people. And also, like some of the Bibles, I don't know, the newer translations, they may have it in poetry form. Because there are some that think it was first written in poetry. And a lot of times they would write stuff in poetry to memorize it. And then put in prose, prose later. But of course, Hebrew poetry is different than what we think of as poetry. When we think of poetry, we think of rhyme, we think of rhythm and that kind of thing. But in Hebrew poetry, it's parallelism. Parallelism is the key to that, where one line either says the same thing as the next line, or maybe the opposite, antithetical or whatever. For example, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. There you have the heavens and firmament are kind of parallel. Glory of God and handiwork are parallel, two ways of saying the same thing. And so Ruth may have been written like that to begin with, and as it was passed down, and it didn't change anything. It's just the way it was written. But some of the newer translations may have it that way. This has it in prose right here, but if you have it like in poem form, that might be the reason why. But anyway, 60% of that book is dialogue between one another. Also, there are no direct conversations with God or appeals to Him. Though the three names for God are found, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but Yahweh or Jehovah, Elohim, and Shaddai, and now these are Hebrew words. They won't come out in the translation like that, but they will come out. For example, if you look at chapter 1, verse 16, and this is one of the most famous verses in the book, but Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." And so there you have God, and you have Lord, Elohim, and this Lord, remember, see that Lord in verse 17 is the uppercase lower O-R-D. And so what Hebrew name does that go back to? Do you remember from a couple weeks ago? Jehovah. Jehovah or Yahweh. Jehovah or Yahweh. And then when you come across Lord, well, it's lowercase O-R-D, then that usually goes back to Shaddai or Adonai. All right, but anyway, so even though there's no prayers to God, there's no God directly talking to them, God's name is mentioned quite a bit, at least for a 4-chapter book. And so God is all over in this book as well. And God's providence is emphasized. In fact, we see that on every page, really, as we do the rest of the Bible. But there's a lot of things that happen that we just think, oh, well, it just happened, coincidence or whatever. But we see the providence of God in this, and that God has His hand in this. And again, as we mentioned, Ruth is found in the genealogy of Jesus. All right, and then another thing, there's a covenant relationship with God is seen through, or though not explicitly mentioned. There is no talk of the temple. There is no talk of feast days or sacrifices or anything like that. But there are some things that are made. We just read 1:16 through 17, where Ruth expresses her commitment to Naomi and to Naomi's God. Well, if you look at Exodus 24, verse 3, Exodus 24 and verse 3, here it says, "So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which the Lord has said, we will do." And again, that's very similar to kind of what she said. Your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God, and so forth. And we'll see some more as we go through the book. But that's kind of echoed there by Ruth. Also, Boaz's commendation of Ruth's love is echoed. Look at Ruth chapter 2 and verse 12. Ruth chapter 2 and verse 12. "The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." But notice, the Lord repay you. And again, he's here commending Ruth's love for Naomi. And if you kind of compare that with Deuteronomy 28, verse 2, Deuteronomy 28, verse 2, and get over there myself. In 28 and verse 2, "And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God." And so again, it's the idea of blessings coming from obedience to God. And that's what Boaz is wishing upon Ruth after seeing her love for Naomi. And then Naomi's complaint in verse 1, chapter 1:21. "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" And again, we'll get to that as we go through this. But she's just lost her husband. She's lost her 2 sons. And so, she's kind of, complaining, so to speak. But that presupposes, in other words, she is disappointed. And of course, we'll especially talk about this in Job. But she's disappointed that, God shouldn't allow these things to happen to her, at least at this moment. She's thinking that. And again, that presupposes that God is supposed to be a covenant God. He's supposed to watch over her and such. And sometimes we think that when something bad happens to people, something bad happens to us, we often think, well, I must be doing something wrong, or God's punishing me. Remember when I lived in Tennessee, I think I mentioned this before, they had this saying, like if a tornado went through, or disaster after disaster went through, they'd say something like, "We must not be paying the preacher." And I'm like, yeah, that's right, man. Fix that, man. But that was their way of saying, God was getting them back at some kind of thing that they were doing. And, they were joking around about it and stuff like that, and we do too sometimes, but we often think that because this happened to this person, he must have been doing something evil, he must have been getting punished for this, and that's really what Job is all about, at least a good section of Job, because all that stuff happened to Job, and he thought that way, the three friends thought that way, but when the thing happened to Job, he knew he didn't sin to deserve that. His friends figured he did, and so they kept trying to get him to confess some sin, and finally they actually accused him of sin, that we'll see later on when we get to that. But just because bad things happen does not mean that God has forsaken us, does not mean that He is punishing us. In fact, even with Job, Job didn't have access to chapters 1 and 2 like you and I have. And we know what's going on there. We know that Satan was testing, accusing Job of serving God for naught, and God put him to the test. Okay, take this away and he'll still be faithful, and he was. But Job didn't know all that. And so just because we suffer doesn't mean that God is against us, and but we'll talk about more of that with Job, all right? So that covenant relationship with God is seen, though not explicitly mentioned. All right, and and another thing, these are just plain old common people. Boaz, Naomi, Ruth and all that, and these bad things happen, and even just regular common people that bad things happen to, God can make great things come out of that. If we just, like they did, trust God, again, fidelity, faith, and family, trust God and just follow His will. All right, any questions on that part of it, or comments?
What do you consider plain old common people?
They weren't kingly, they weren't royal bloodline. Well, they ended up being that through Christ, but they weren't wealthy, they weren't privileged, they were just, in fact, as we read, the famine was in their land and they took off, that's how they ended up in Moab. And so, they were just, they weren't superheroes. I mean, they were in the sense of faithfulness, but they're no different than you and I, in other words. No different than you and I. All right? So far as an outline, it comes a little bit over there. But this, we'll just look at these points here. An Israelite family in Moab, the return to Judah, Ruth's gleaning, the threshing floor at the city gate, and the resulting family that came from that. All right? So that's how we'll approach this. All right, let's look at verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons, the name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. All right, and so they go down to Moab. Now there it says there was a famine in Judah. All right, now famines have played a big part in events with God's people. What were some of the famines, maybe famous famines we might say, that happened before this? Yeah, absolutely. When Joseph, of course, sold by his brothers, taken away, Potiphar's house, into prison, and finally, second in command. And that's what brought Joseph's brothers over to Egypt to begin with. There was a great famine in the land of Judah, and so they came over there to get food. And of course, Joseph had those dreams, and Pharaoh and the boys, they were all ready for the famine. They had stored up some food over the years, and so they were ready for it, and so that was a big famine there. And actually, there's about 3 other famines mentioned in the book of Genesis. But this is interesting here. This is the first famine that's ever mentioned since coming into the Promised Land. Okay, because you had the book of Joshua, Judges, and then you have this famine here. So it's been a long time in recorded biblical history at this point since a famine has been mentioned. All right? And so you had this man from Bethlehem, Judah, And there were about it seems like three different Bethlehems in the Palestine area. And this is the one from Judah. And remember, I think it was Micah 5:2, Bethlehem Ephratah. And so you have it named there. But anyway, they went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. And so we have Elimelech, Naomi, and then the two sons, Chilion, and that's CH. You know, I got this fancy computer that'll pronounce it for you, but they all pronounce it like a hard CH, like character, K. And so Chilion and Mahlon. All right, so that's the family right there so far. And again, they're from Bethlehem, Judah, and he also mentions down here that they Ephratites of Bethlehem. All right, and you know, Bethlehem Ephratah kind of ties into Ephrathite, and so it's that Judah. So they were actually from the same place where Jesus would eventually be born. All right. And then the land of Moab, well, I guess I don't have my little pointer thing, it's way up there. But it's that purple spot right down there below the Dead Sea. Yeah, now that, I don't know why these maps, but they kind of, you know, we're accustomed to seeing it upright, but they kind of, I guess, twist it that way. And I don't know if just because they can fit more on it, or maybe that's the curvature of the earth or something. Yeah, that's what I was saying, maybe because the curvature of the earth or something. Because I know like the maps we look at, everything is kind of straight up and all that, and they got them folded out in square sheet and stuff, but yeah. But anyway, you see where Moab is, and, well, I guess I'll get that little pointer thing. But, you know, they're from over there. Bethlehem Ephratah is, right there. And they're over here in Moab somewhere, and it doesn't say exactly where in Moab they are, but they're over there. And of course, you know, of all the places to go, you wonder why Moab, but maybe it being on the other side of the Dead Sea here, maybe it wasn't as famished as the area over there was. But anyway, they end up in Moab. And then he names, wrong way. And then he names the people there. And then notice in verse 3 through 5, the death of Naomi's husband. Verse 3, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. All right, she was left and her two sons. All right, and of course there is, again, rabbinic tradition, which again, you know, it's just an interesting fact to me, but a lot of the rabbis will talk about Elimelech suffered because he took the people over, he took his family to Moab. He should have never done that, and so God was punishing him. And again, that's the same thing that we were talking about earlier, that a lot of people think that just because somebody suffers, they must have done something wrong. But again, that's not the case at all. It doesn't tell us how he died, it doesn't tell us why he died, it just tells us that he died, and so we'll just leave it at that. He died. All right? And so she was left and her two sons. And then they took wives of women of Moab. All right? Now again, we've mentioned this before. I think we even had a slide on it in the Sunday morning sermon. But were God's people allowed to marry outside of their tribes? Not at all. Not back then. They were not. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 3 talks about that. When you go into the promised land, you know, don't marry among them and so forth. Also Deuteronomy 17:17 mentions that. And that passage talks about kings multiplying wives. But again, the principle is the same there. And so they were not to intermarry. Now, of course, read some that suggested that perhaps they were proselyted before they married them. But again, it doesn't say that either. So either way, but they married Moabites. And so, you know, even if they had no right to marry them, if they did not proselyte, they would not have. But even then, even if they proselyte, I don't think they could have. But anyway, we do have a passage in Deuteronomy 23:3 that says a male Moabite was never allowed to go into the temple. Well, look at that, Deuteronomy 23, verse 3. But anyway, but even out of a situation like that, God can make something good come out of that. But Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3.
No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord.
Okay, there you go. Until, right. None of his descendants shall either enter before the Lord forever. Shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Okay? And so, you know, they were to stay out. And and so forth. But anyway, so that was for men. But again, these women here are Moabites. They married. And so even in that situation, God can make something good come out of it. And yeah, because when you look about the women mentioned in the genealogy of Christ, you know, most of them had potentially shady characters. You know, in other words, Rahab with the harlot. You had Tamar, and you had Ruth here, a Moabitess, which just that, you know, just a Gentile, at least from a non-Israelite. And then, of course, Bathsheba, but yet they're still mentioned in the genealogy of Christ. And so, you know, God can make good things happen even out of situations like that. And so now we have, whoops, oh man, got to hold it the right way, okay? Now we have a family like that. All right, so Elimelech, Naomi, Orpah, the two sons, and they married.
I may get a little bit ahead of you, but when she makes that declaration, she severs her ties with the Moabites.
Oh, yeah.
Because that would that'd be similar, I compare it to baptism today. Because she's turned her back on everything, the traditions of her father,
Right.
the parents, and her parenting lineage. And, you know, I always wonder when you read that clause about their especially later on when they come back out of the captivity, about the Moabites and how they had to put away their wives. When you think about who was Moabite, Ruth was. So there's something there that God has designated her. She's special.
Oh, yeah.
And her change in her life when she turns her back, and she's left all that behind.
Yeah, and of course she'd already been married 10 years at least 10 years, because you know, look at verse at the end of verse 4. It says they dwelt there about 10 years after they were married. So again, you know, but we know she's a special lady for sure. God made it that way.
Well, I also think the story is a story that, you know, this is something that we can use today.
Absolutely.
That you don't have to be special to be a child of God.
Don't have to be perfect.
And it doesn't matter what your station in life is or what
Absolutely.
you've done in the past.
Absolutely.
You know, God
Because
still loves
yeah,
you.
because if you make that declaration, commit yourself to God, that's the key right there.
One of the points you might make concerning that 10 years is there were no children, there were no grandchildren of Naomi. So there would have been already potentially male inheritance.
Right.
So for some reason, neither one of these families had children.
Yeah, good point. And notice that's Orpah, not Oprah. Okay.
My Bible says that Malon and Chilon mean sickly and failing. So,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it's
I
interesting.
wonder if they were sickly people. And
Could have
maybe
been.
that's why they didn't have children.
Yeah, it could have been, and that may have been why the famine did them in and didn't do the others in. And again, it doesn't say how they died, but that's a very interesting point there. And that's talking about the meaning of the Hebrew words had that meaning there.
Same thing with Noah. There are no reports of their children having children.
Noah, well, we do have the lineages of Noah, yeah. Right, not till after the flood, correct, yeah, right. Yep. All right.
And Oprah's mother thought that's what she was naming her.
Oh, did she? Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm glad she messed that up. Okay, no, I don't know. Anyway, I guess it doesn't matter. But anyway, then the men died, and with the men dying, you have the three ladies remaining, okay? And so that's where we are here in verse 5, the end of verse 5. And so then both Malon and Chilion died also. And so the woman survived, her and her two sons, and her husband. Okay, all right. And then her return to Judah in verse 6, and Naomi's appeal. Look at verses 6 through 15. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited His people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from this place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Then they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go. For I am too old to have a husband, if I should say I have hope. If I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourself from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, and we'll say that there, but through verse 15, that's the point they're having. All right, and so Ruth's pledge, okay. All right, anyway, notice in verse 6, she heard from in the country of Moab. And so she's in Moab, and the language just kind of sounds like, God is taking care of his people in Moab. When I first read that, that's what it looked like. But the idea is, while she was in the country of Moab, she heard that the Lord had visited his people, and implied there visited his people in Judah by giving them bread. And so she's going to go back over there, back to Judah. And because again, she was in Moab all this time. And again, we talked a little bit about this, but earlier when it says the Lord visited his people. And that word visited is a very interesting study by itself. Sometimes it can mean he pronounced judgment upon the people, but whatever the context, it's something, the idea he came down and took care of what had to be taken care of. And so the famine appears to be over. At least that's what Naomi has heard. And so she is ready to go back to Judah and to go back to Judah. Now, apparently, they seem to have been on the way quite a while before she finally tells them that it would be better for them to go back. And, verse 7, as she journeyed, her daughters-in-law went with her. They went, and they were going to return to the land of Judah. And then Naomi in verse 8. And so, we don't know how much time elapsed in verse 7. We do know that Judah would have been a long journey away. Wow, that's quick. Anyway, in verse 8, she comes to that conclusion, go return each to her mother's house. And I found that very interesting, to her mother's house, rather than to your father's house. But I guess with women would go to their mother's house, and the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And so she's desiring that they go back to their own families, and maybe find a husband there. And again, actually, I kind of didn't mention this when I thought about it when I was reading that. Remember with Hannah, a while back when Jason was teaching those lessons from 1 Samuel chapter 1, she wanted to have a baby really, really bad. And that was typical, even today, I think, but especially back in that day and age. Women wanted to have babies, they wanted to raise children. Men that married them wanted their names to continue. And in a culture like Israel of Old Testament, that needed to be the case. And that's why they had the laws you can only marry within your tribe, inheritance laws, such as they were, to keep that nation going, to keep those people going until the Lord, Christ, would come to that lineage. And so, Naomi is thinking that way. She's wanting only the best for her daughters-in-law. And so she thinks it's best if they go back to their homelands. That way they can find their husbands, another husband, and they can raise children, and everything would be normal with their life. And most of the time, even with Orpah, that's what she did. And most women would have done that, but not Ruth. And I think there's something significant with that. But notice in verse 9, the Lord grant that you may find rest. And that term, Hebrew term translated find rest, really is a term that means peace and happiness. Find peace and happiness. And one commentator, James Smith, he says, quote, this find rest refers to the qualities of an ideal marriage in which a godly woman can find strength, security, well-being, and love. And so that find rest in this context has to do with, so you can go be married and live happily ever after. to the story here. And so she kissed them and lifted their voice and they wept. All right, now this time, well, they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. And so they said that, and that would be both Orpah and Ruth. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters, why will you go with me? Are there still sons of my wombs, etc.? And so that, verse 11 and 12, apparently convinced Orpah to go back. Because he says in verse 15, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her God. But with Ruth, it didn't. Because again, Ruth was committed, fidelity, faith, and family. She was committed to Naomi and her family. All right? And so then verse 16, of course, we won't have time to finish this out, but we'll go ahead and introduce that there. And so Ruth said, oh yeah, also look at verse 15. Look, your sister-in-laws have gone back to her gods. And that word God is Elohim. Does the King James have a singular or plural? Again, verse 15. Look, to your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods.
Gods, little g.
Yeah, God. Yeah. So does this one here. And that's another case of Elohim. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. The word is actually plural. And sometimes it's translated little g, plural, gods, but it can also be translated big G, God, singular. In the beginning, God created. But yeah, so they went back to their gods, of course, the Moabites and all that, different gods and such. And but again, Orpah was finally convinced to go back to her family, but not Ruth. She stayed, and of course, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Those are some pretty strong words of commitment. If anything but death. Yeah, let me just say here before the bell rings. Sometimes you'll hear this at a wedding, between a bride and her groom, which is all right, but make sure you understand the context between a mother and her daughter. Okay? Well, I still find it very good too. They call her a daughter still, even though the husband is deceased. So I can still call my father my father. Because Josh's parents were both deceased when I married her. Okay. But anyway, we'll have to call her again. We'll close right here anyway. I appreciate your attention, and we'll just get started this. And this will probably take us about 2 more classes.